Good afternoon and most welcome to Heidegger 1352. I will now finish off the article Steps to the Metaphysics of Incompleteness. There will also be quotes from the books Incomplete Nature and The Symbolic Species. These two books are written solely by Terrence W. Deacon, whereas the article is in collaboration with Tyrone Cashman. And now we are venturing into time. And something that already impressed me about Terrence Deacon is that he is widely eclectic. The range of the things he's writing about is covering all areas of human understanding. So he seemed to be what Ian McGilchrist would call right-brainer. And now we're getting into time. My hunch, I've been reading a lot of books during this series and even more before the series began. And the ability you get is not a very impressive one. It reminds me of a friend who studied cinematic action, and he's very good in a movie to sort of foretell what is going to happen based on some few clues in the movie. And one thing he told me, a cough in a movie, somebody coughing, usually means that that person is going to die pretty soon. And it's true. And here, in my case, it's more of a hunch. When we get into time, I think that it's very important for the complete understanding. I can follow up that hunch to say that in quantum mechanics, the fuller understanding how time and space works in quantum mechanics, to a certain level they don't seem even to be present. But for the understanding to come, they need to be simultaneous. Yes, it sounds a bit funny. How can space and time be simultaneously? Well, you will understand it when you get into it. But let me put it this way. When the understanding of time and space are both present, both time and space separately and together makes more sense. Whereas once you got it, you will understand it's very hard to understand time alone. I am at page 26. There's just a few pages left. And the chapter is called About Time, Eloquently and Concise. So to complete this journey into a realm where even angels should fear to tread, let's explore this last great mystery from an even more speculative perspective. consider another variant of incompletability. The concept of imaginary numbers. The classic formulation involves trying to determine the square root of a negative number. The relationship of this to the liar's paradox and the buzzer can be illustrated by stepping through stages of solving the equation I times I equals -1. Dividing both sides by I produces I equals -1 through I. And then substituting the value of I, one gets -1 through -1 through I, and so forth indefinitely. With each substitution, the value alternates from negative to positive and cannot be resolved, like the true-false of the liar's paradox and the on-off of the buzzer. But if we ignore this irresolvability and just explore the properties of this representation of an irresolvable value, as have mathematicians for centuries, it can be shown that I can be treated as a form of unity and subject to all the same mathematical principles as can 1, and all the real numbers derived from it. So I plus I equals 2I, and I minus 2I equals minus I, and so on. Interestingly, 0 times I equals 0 times 1 equals 1, 0. So we can conceive of the real number line and the imaginary number line as two dimensions intersecting at 0, the origin. And the imaginary number line as two dimensions intersecting at 0, the origin. Ignoring the many uses of such a relationship, we can see that this also has an open-ended consequence. This is because the very same logic can be used with respect to the imaginary number line. We can thus assign j times j 2 minus 1 to generate a third dimension that is orthogonal to the first two and also intersecting at the origin. Indeed, this can be done again and again without completion, increasing dimensionality without end. So what could this abstract exercise have to do with time? First, consider the meaning of negative values. They can represent subtracted quantities, absences, or something constrained. So the various versions of the liar's paradox we have discussed can be understood as an absence times an absence times an absence, and so on. A self-undermining relation that alternates in value but does not resolve. The three spatial dimensions allow us to discern differences, that is, where things are present and absent. As we have seen, there are things that are present with respect to an absence, and absent with respect to a presence. If the imaginary number analogy is relevant here, first consider the meaning of negative values. We'll make a small retake. They can represent subtracted quantities, absences, or something constrained. So the various versions of the liar's paradox we have discussed can be understood as an absence times an absence times an absence, and so on. A self-undermining relation that alternates in values but do not resolve. The three spatial dimensions allow us to discern differences. That is where things are present and absent. As we have seen, there are things that are present with respect to an absence and absent with respect to a presence. If the imaginary number analogy is relevant here, then we must admit the possibility of an indefinite dimensionality to the nature of existence and the necessity of irresolvable change. Charles Peirce became fascinated with triadic relations, in part because he noticed that triadic relations could be combined to produce 4-part, 5-part, and n-part relationships. So 3 dimensions, 1 and I and J, are sufficient to deal with fixed relationships of arbitrary complexity. But then there is change to account for. In the Einsteinian universe, time is a single spatialized dimension in which there are differences of relative position and in which movement is in some sense illusory. Indeed, the Einsteinian universe is often depicted as a four-dimensional block universe. In such a universe, the future and the past are fixed. Even if we insinuate quantum indeterminacy into this picture, there isn't any real chance, because all past and future configurations are fixed, even in a multiverse. Pointer to Everett and Tegmark, maybe. But what if time is itself the fact of incompletable dimensionality? Not a single spatialized dimension, but a feature of the open-ended nature of present absent relationships compounded on each other. Though the abstractedness and the hand-waviness of these last few speculations cannot be rigorously defended, they are relevant to consider in the light of another deeply held intuition, the sense that strong emergence is an inevitable feature of the universe. And true creative freedom is fundamental. In this respect, the term imaginary dimension may be at the same time both misleading and prescient. Ultimate apophasis. From a teleological perspective, this exploration may also have interesting implications. To the extent that one imagines God to include teleological properties, or to embody something like knowledge, the inescapability of this paradoxical undecidability may be worth considering. This is particularly relevant in the light of the Thomistic argument that the only limitation relevant to God is the necessity of non-contradiction. Non-contradiction is required for consistency, and the avoidance of equivocation. But as Gödel discovered, to preserve consistency, we must accept fundamental incompleteness. So it is relevant to ask to what extent these constraints might apply even to the essential nature of God. Or perhaps to the inconceivability of God. Dionysius, the pseudo-Areopagite, influenced many theologians in the West with his negative theology. He claimed that we cannot conceive of God. cannot articulate in words what God is, no matter how hard we try, because there is no adequate correspondence between a finite mind and language and an infinite mind. A finite being and an infinite being. So whatever we imagine or intellectually reason God to be, or even to be like, we must deny that He is like that. When we think of God's compassion, we must deny that it is anything like the compassion that humans can have for one another. When we think of God, the Creator, we must not think of any type of creation that we know of. God's creation cannot be like what a carpenter or sculptor would do. Nor can his creation be anything like the Big Bang. A medieval statement of this approach was nec taliter, nec qualiter, sed totaliter aliter. Not of this kind, nor of this quality, but totally different. From this perspective, it makes little sense to talk of God's purposes or influence with respect to worldly processes. Or even ultimate conceptions of being. Indeed, there is not only a profound reverence and humility expressed in such a theology, there is also a deep reasonableness in it, which may be relevant to metaphysical speculation as well. A metaphysics of ultimate incompleteness a Gödelian metaphysics, if you will. Can neither be based on a complete and perfect foundation, nor can it allow contradictories, the ultimate apophasis. But as the Tao Te Ching tells us, the nameless is the beginning of the 10,000 things. Conclusions. Incompleteness and the spiritual life. The spiritual life has been called for many centuries in the West and in the East the path of perfection. The word perfection has in its etymology and in its core significance the meaning finished. That which is perfect is not merely done. It is done all the way through. That is, completely. The spiritual path in the West has been, in a way, bedeviled by this concept. The concept finds its root in the extreme difficulty that Greek thinkers had with the changeability of the world. Motion, change, was not really intelligible. So the early Greek thinkers were right about that. But they were convinced in a deep way that for something to be real, it had to be intelligible. So they came to the conclusion that only that which is exactly what it is can be real, can have being. Aristotle trained in both close observation of the biological world and in the Platonic tradition of pure unchangeable forms. took it upon himself to solve the mystery of motion. A large portion of his theoretical structure is an effort to bring some intellectual clarity to kinesis, motion, and change. In the Physics 257 b6, he concludes, what moves is the movable. That is what is potentially in motion, but not actually. And the potential progresses toward actuality. Motion is the incomplete actualization of the movable. What we are working to do in parallel with Aristotle is to understand the metaphysics of incompleteness. We are claiming that there is something essentially incomplete about this universe. Aristotle, in bringing motion into his metaphysics, was attempting what we see as a first step in an accurate assessment of the universe that we encounter and that gave us birth. Once we open ourselves up to the possibility that it is a mistake to imagine that to be real has to be permanent, eternal, pure, completely present. Then we can take another look at what must be a metaphysics of the impermanent, the temporary, the absent, the changing. We can see in the spiritual life a kind of fetishism of perfection. Of the completion that is the truly good, the flawless, the blameless, the single right response to any moral case before us. We propose that just as the truth of this incomplete universe is not what it is. But what is emerging. So the root being of the universe is not ontological permanence, but emerging creativity. The coming to be of what was not. In spiritual practice, this understanding frees us from the judgment of perfection, of the good as completion. The art form that is the relevant analogy to the spiritual life is dance, not sculpture. Motion, as Aristotle clarified, is essentially incomplete. The spiritual life is the doing, the practice, the going. Not the arriving. The authenticity of the spiritual path is the walking of the path. The paradox of the spiritual life then is that which is perfectus is forever incomplete. It is only in incompleteness that the real, the good, the true, the one and the beautiful come into being. And that, my friends, concludes my reading of Steps to Metaphysics of Incompleteness. I will take a quote from Incomplete Nature. Rather massive book by Terrence W. Deacon alone. I found this to be helpful. Consider the famous Zeno's paradox. Which was framed in terms of a race between swift Achilles and a tortoise. Which was given a slight head start. Zeno argued that moving any distance involved moving through an infinite series of fractions of that distance. One half, 1/4, 1/8, 1/16, and so on. because of the infinite number of these fractions, Achilles could apparently never traverse them all, and so would never reach the finish line. Worse yet, it appeared that Achilles could never even overtake the tortoise. Because every time he reached that fraction of the distance to where the tortoise had just been, the tortoise would have moved just a bit further. I believe, and I'll make a jump here, that we have been under the spell of a sort of Zeno's paradox of the mind. Like the ancient mathematicians, confused by the behavior of zero and unwilling to countenance incorporating it into their calculations. We seem baffled by the fact that absent reference, unrealized ends and abstract values have definite physical consequences. Despite their apparently null physicality. And when it comes to the imagined number, it is even less than null. As a result, we have excluded these relations from playing constitutive roles in the natural sciences. So despite the obvious and unquestioned role played by functions, purposes, meanings, and values in the organization of our bodies and minds, and in the changes taking place in the world around us, our scientific theories still have to officially deny them anything but a sort of heuristic legitimacy. This has contributed to many tortured theoretical tricks and contorted rhetorical maneuvers in order either to obscure this deep inconsistency or else to claim that it must forever remain beyond the reach of science. And I end the quote from Incomplete Nature there, last paragraph on page 11, ending at 12. I will put something else in the extraordinary breadth and width and depth of Terrence Deacon. Emerging universals. And this is from page 115 of the Symbolic Species. I believe that recognizing the capacity of languages to evolve and adapt with respect to human hosts is crucial to understanding another long-standing mystery about language that theories of innate knowledge were developed to explain. The source of language universals. Grammatical universals exists, but I want to suggest that their existence does not imply that they are prefigured in the brain like frozen evolutionary accident. Chomsky. In fact, I suspect that universal rules or implicit axioms of grammar are not really stored or located anywhere, and in an important sense, they are not determined at all. Instead, I want to suggest the radical possibility that they have emerged spontaneously and independently in each evolving language in response to universal biases in the selection processes affecting language transmission. I end the quote on page 116. So you see here, Terrence Deacon is touching all over the subjects. The universals in language is so difficult, so the whole of linguistic was constructed to study those eternal universals. And we got stuck in that thinking. And that thinking is a diminishing of something that is much, much greater. It's a narrowing of the scope. For me, I always felt it's a little bit like holding a pair of binoculars the wrong way around and then trying to look at some birds. You can imagine your vision becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. The imaginary numbers are real because they are part of reality, although everyone thinks them to be unreal, imaginary, nonsensical. And also despite that almost immoral act of using them everywhere. When I studied to be an engineer, a whole semester was devoted to them because they partake in every electric calculation you can make that includes magnetic fields, induction or transduction. Maybe there's a question here. I can stretch myself a little bit.
Thank you, Hans. I loved the last part about the adjective perfect. That is only in incompleteness that the good emerges. That is only in the incompleteness that the good emerges. We need incompleteness. And that made me think about a Bible verse, Romans 10:4. Little bit Greek here. Telos kar Christou. Excuse me. Nomu Christos. And that is so. This means the Christ is the end of law. Christ is the end of the law, and scholars have debated endlessly about this word. Does it mean end, or goal, or termination point? And personally, I found it a ridiculous discussion because I think telos is everything at the same time, like the adjective perfect. That is, okay, Christ can be the end of the Mosaic law, but this can also be the goal where you are going. So he has not terminated the law completely, but is still like this, what they say about perfectus, is the language that misleads us, the Latin perfectus. So we need both a goal, that is, the law can be a goal, but at the same time it's also something that is finished. So this is the incompleteness that we reach our goal. And I love that about the word perfect. So that's great by great Deacon and Cashman. Do you want to add something, Hans?
Well, this is also the same as the paradox of Xenon, because Xenon also wants to make it what he thought was the difference between the end, the goal, and the travel. And it doesn't make any sense at all. Once you start realizing it's all down to the absence of time. So we have something interesting here, I think. Very good. Thank you very much. Thank you for listening, and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.
Thank you.